Hello my lovelies, my name's Gilbert Dolthalion and the plan for today is to show you another common method for sewing bias and other kinds of binding. This is a follow-up to my last couple of videos and last time I showed you another common way of sewing it, so feel free to check the card or the description down below if you want to watch that later. This method comes with two variants. You can either do it completely by machine or you can finish it off by hand if you want to go for a more invisible couture look, or if you're trying to fit your binding around some really extreme shapes and you need the control from hand sewing. But for either method you don't need anything more exciting than what you're sewing and your standard tools, so if you've got those ready, let's get to the method. As with the last method, this starts with the shorter side of the bias binding, if your bias binding has it, which not all commercial bias binding does these days. Once again, if it's lacking this, you can either trim down the bias binding itself or offset it from the edge of your sewing, so the bias binding hangs over slightly. For this method, you need to start by sewing the bias binding right side to the right side of your sewing, once again lining the edge of your sewing up with the edge of the binding, assuming that the distance between the fold and the edge of your sewing matches up with your seam allowance, which is standard. Once it's pinned, sew it using the fold line as your guide, and then, as always, press it. Now flip your work over and pin the binding down, with the fold between it and your sewing. It should cover the stitch line from earlier, and if it doesn't, you'll need to adjust it until it does, either by unpicking and resewing the first line of stitching, or for an easier but less precise method, trimming or folding the edge to allow the binding to come over further. At this point, the two methods divide, so we'll cover the machine first, but I'll leave a timestamp if you want to jump ahead to the sewing method. We're now on the stitch in the ditch method, because we're going to flip it back over to the front of your sewing, and sew the back down from the front using the ditch formed between the binding and the rest of your sewing. Even well pressed, this is always there, and by getting our stitches as close to it as possible, or even in between, we can make them almost invisible. You do need to be precise though, so take your time. Once it's done, if you flip it back over, it should have caught the edge of the binding on the reverse side, hopefully in a much neater line than this, but especially while you're learning, you might have to unpick a couple of bits and re-sew them if it misses. Sewing blind is just never as precise as it could be. And then there's the second option, to finish off the hem on the back by hand. The best option here is a whip stitch, and because you can control more precisely the back, it'll be easier to make sure that you cover the stitching from the first seam. If you can control your stitches and keep them fine, this method should blend in well, so it's the most invisible way of stitching binding on. So that's stitch in the ditch and a hand finishing variant of sewing binding. Please remember though that these techniques and the one from last week aren't necessarily just for sewing bias binding, there's plenty of other things you can do with them. Stitch in the ditch in particular I've used a lot around collars and in other places where I've wanted joins to be hidden. For this cape, for example, rather than having the weight of a full lining or the seams visible on the inside, I attach this end piece using stitch in the ditch so that it's covered on both sides but also neat and clean on both sides. The best advice I can give you for both of these techniques is to take your time and be precise. It's all about hiding that second seam, and the more focus you give it, the more hidden it will be and the more neat your piece will look. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe found it interesting and helpful, and if you did, please think about giving me a like and subscribing if you're not already for more sewing and costume related content. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who made it through to the end, and to all of my lovely subscribers. You guys are the best. Thank you for sticking with me. Stay safe, stay sensible, and I shall see you again soon. Bye!